When the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared into the dark waters of Lake Superior, it was as if the world itself swallowed her whole. In the immediate aftermath, rescue crews rushed to the site, hoping against hope that survivors might be clinging to debris or that at least the bodies of the men could be recovered. But nothing surfaced. No lifeboats bobbing in the water, no floating wreckage drifting with the waves, not even the remains of the 29 men who had been aboard. It was an eerie silence, a silence so complete that it felt unnatural. Sailors who had seen tragedies on the water before knew that death often leaves a visible trail. Bodies rise, evidence floats, closure follows. But on Lake Superior that November, the lake refused to give anything back. It held on tightly to the men and their ship, and from that day forward, the Fitzgerald was not just another wreck. It was an underwater grave, untouched and forbidden. The waters above became sacred and dangerous. Disturbing the site was not only taboo but also punishable by law, with million-dollar fines for trespassers. And this raised a chilling question. What exactly did the authorities know? What was so unsettling down there that they felt the world should never see it? For decades, speculation swirled. The Fitzgerald wasn't just any ship. It was the pride of the Great Lakes. The thought of her sinking so quickly, so completely, without even a distress signal, struck terror in the hearts of sailors. The Great Lakes had always been dangerous. Stories of November storms destroying ships went back centuries, but the Fitzgerald's end was different. The swiftness of it, the mystery of it, and the absence of human remains all fed into something larger. Divers who reached the wreck in 1994 would later reveal truths about the lake's freezing depths that shocked the public and confirmed suspicions long whispered among locals. But before those revelations came, before the wreck became legend, the Fitzgerald was something else entirely. A marvel of her time, a floating giant that commanded respect. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the ship itself, and why so many believed she could never sink. The story begins in June 1958. At a shipyard in River Rouge, Michigan, workers and onlookers gathered to witness the launch of what would become the largest vessel ever to sail the inland seas of North America. The Edmund Fitzgerald was 729 feet long, an engineering feat that stretched nearly 3 football fields. It was no accident that she measured just 1 foot short of the maximum length. Allowed through the St. Lawrence Seaway, her designers had calculated every detail to maximize efficiency while still permitting passage through the crucial trade route connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. Her size alone made her remarkable, but she was not only big, she was also sleek, fast, and built to haul massive cargoes of iron ore. The ship was named after Edmund Bacon Fitzgerald, the chairman of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, the company that had commissioned her construction. To the public, the name may have sounded odd for a vessel. Ships were often named for places, ideals, or poetic phrases. But to the shipping industry, it symbolized power and stability. Fitzgerald himself was there on launch day, beaming with pride as the ship slid into the water for the very first time. She was not just a ship. She was a promise of commerce, efficiency, and industrial might at a time when America's steel industry was booming. For 17 years, the Fitzgerald carried her heavy loads, taconite iron ore pellets mined in the Mesabi Range of Minnesota, across the cold expanse of the lakes. Her destination was often the factories of Detroit, Toledo, and other industrial cities where the ore would be transformed into the steel that built cars, buildings, and bridges. These were the lifelines of the American Midwest, and the Fitzgerald was one of the great workhorses of that economy. With each trip, her reputation grew. She wasn't just reliable, she was admired. Crews affectionately called her the Mighty Fitz. To those who worked aboard her, she was more than metal and rivets. She was alive, a floating city that responded to the will of her crew. Her captain, Ernest McSorley, was a man cut from the cloth of Great Lakes tradition. By the time he took command of the Fitzgerald, he had spent more than 40 years on these inland seas. He was known as cautious but respected, a steady hand in storms that others feared. Born in Ontario, McSorley had built a reputation for being calm under pressure. the kind of man who could look at black skies and high waves and still find a safe path forward. To sailors, trust in the captain was everything, and in McSorley, the Fitzgerald had a leader they believed in. By 1975, he was 63 years old and had already announced his plans to retire at the end of the shipping season. After decades of battling the unpredictable moods of the lakes, he was ready to step ashore for good. But before he could leave, fate asked him for one last voyage, a voyage that would etch his name and the Fitzgeralds into history forever. November on Lake Superior is not like other months. Sailors have a phrase for it: the witches of November come stealing. It's a line borrowed from old songs and whispered in every port town on the Great Lakes. The storms that strike during this time are unlike summer squalls or spring tempests. They come with the weight of winter behind them, fueled by Arctic winds, clashing air masses, and sudden drops in temperature. They are swift, violent, and often deadly. To those who know the lake, November is a month to respect, a time when even the strongest vessels tread carefully. McSorley knew this. Every sailor on the Great Lakes did. Yet shipping never stopped. Industry demanded it. And captains answered the call. On November 9, 1975, the Fitzgerald left the port of Superior, Wisconsin. Fully loaded with more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, her destination was Zug Island, near Detroit, where the ore would be used in steelmaking. She was not alone on her journey. Close by sailed the SS Arthur M. Anderson, another freighter with its own cargo and crew. Together, the two ships set out across the vastness of Lake Superior, cutting through waters that looked calm but carried the promise of change. For a time, the voyage was uneventful. The ships moved like giants across the lake, steady and powerful. To the men aboard, it felt routine. Another trip, another delivery, another day of work on the water. But beneath that sense of routine, the lake was already stirring. Lake Superior is unlike any other body of water. It is the largest of the Great Lakes, holding more water than the other four combined. Its depths reach more than 1,300 feet in places, cold and black, a world few humans have ever seen. It creates its own weather, sometimes changing from calm to furious in minutes. Sailors have long called it unforgiving. It does not care about experience, reputation, or the size of the vessel. Ships disappear here, and when they do, they are often swallowed whole. The Edmund Fitzgerald was about to become the most famous example of that truth, but in those first hours of November 9th, no one aboard her knew what awaited. They only knew the routine of the work, the hum of the engines, the steel hull cutting through gray waters, and the captain at the helm, steady and confident. The Fitzgerald was in her prime that autumn. 17 years of service had not dulled her reputation. Crews liked working on her because she was fast, she was dependable, and she had an almost regal quality compared to other freighters. Her cabins were more spacious, her amenities slightly better, and there was a sense of pride in being part of her voyages. Stories circulated among sailors about her record-setting speeds and her impressive handling. She was seen as indestructible, a floating fortress against the storms. And yet that sense of invincibility would prove fatal. History has a cruel way of humbling what seems untouchable. In the days leading up to her final voyage, there were no signs of doom. McSorley was focused, his crew was experienced, and the ship was ready for another run. The weather reports, while warning of possible storms, gave no clear indication of just how fierce the coming system would become. The Fitzgerald left port as she had countless times before, her bow cutting the cold November water, her stern loaded heavy with iron ore, her men settling into the routines of watch duty, meals, and maintenance. It was the beginning of what should have been another successful trip. But within 24 hours, the lake would remind them, and the world, why it is never to be underestimated. November 10th, 1975, dawned with a gray sky stretched tight over Lake Superior. At first light, the water carried the deceptive calm that so often precedes disaster. For those on board the Edmund Fitzgerald, the day began with the routines of a freighter, men taking their watch, engines humming steadily, and the ship plowing through the open water. But on the horizon, signs of change were gathering. The weather that had been predicted to worsen was now shifting rapidly into something far more severe. To the men aboard both the Fitzgerald and the Anderson, the day would prove to be unlike any they had ever faced. By mid-morning, the barometric pressure began to plummet. Old sailors knew what that meant. A storm was tightening its grip. The November gales were infamous, feared more than any other weather the Great Lakes could summon. These weren't just wind and rain. They were destructive forces that whipped the vast inland sea into a frenzy, creating waves as tall as buildings and winds that screamed like banshees across the decks. Local fishermen and veteran captains alike had given them a name: the Witches of November. It wasn't poetic exaggeration. The storms of that month were so treacherous that they had claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries. The Fitzgerald, for all her size and strength, was about to meet her match. Captain Ernest McSorley, experienced as he was, kept a close eye on the conditions. Communication between his ship and the Anderson became more frequent as the morning wore on. The two vessels weren't traveling side by side. In fact, the Anderson trailed behind by several miles. But they maintained contact, keeping one another informed about their progress and the weather. This was common practice, especially when storms brewed. The Great Lakes were vast, but there was comfort in knowing another vessel was nearby, watching the same horizon, fighting the same battle. As noon approached, the wind intensified. Gusts were being measured at speeds close to hurricane force. 80 miles per hour, then higher still. The Fitzgerald, with her heavy load of iron ore, cut deep into the water, her bow lifting and crashing as waves rose up to meet her. 30-foot walls of water slammed against the steel hull. Spray lashed across the decks, freezing instantly in the bitter air. The crew fought to stay steady on their feet as the mighty freighter shuddered with each impact. The Anderson, following behind, recorded similar chaos. At times, its radar screen lit up with shifting echoes of waves so large they seemed impossible for an inland sea. The captain of the Anderson, Jesse Cooper, later described waves that rose 35 feet or higher, monstrous swells that dwarfed the ship and threatened to roll it with each passing crest. Yet the Fitzgerald pressed forward, her engines straining, her captain determined to make Whitefish Bay, the safe harbor on Michigan's Upper Peninsula. By early afternoon, the storm had transformed the lake into a battlefield. Communication lines buzzed with reports of worsening conditions. The Coast Guard issued warnings to all vessels still on Superior, urging caution, urging shelter. But shelter was many miles away, and for the Fitzgerald, turning back was not an option. Her size and cargo made her less maneuverable, and once committed to a course, changing direction in such conditions could prove even more dangerous than forging ahead. It was around this time that the first signs of real trouble aboard the Fitzgerald began to appear. Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with news that his ship had developed a list. This meant the vessel was leaning noticeably to one side, a dangerous development in storm conditions. A list could indicate shifting cargo, flooding in the holds, or damage to the hull. Any one of these could spell disaster, but McSorley's tone remained steady. He reported the problem as calmly as if he were reading from a checklist. His voice gave no hint of panic, but his words carried weight. A ship of the Fitzgerald's size should not have been listing so early in the storm. Shortly afterward, another message came. Both of the Fitzgerald's radar systems were down. For a modern freighter, radar was the lifeline. In a storm where visibility dropped to nearly zero, radar allowed the crew to navigate, track their position, and avoid collisions with unseen land or other ships. Without it, the Fitzgerald was effectively blind, relying only on rough estimates, charts, and radio communication with the Anderson to know where she was. McSorley reported the situation matter-of-factly, but to any sailor, the implications were chilling. To lose radar in the midst of a November gale was akin to closing one's eyes while running through a burning building. As daylight began to fade, the storm grew even more violent. The Fitzgerald's crew reported waves washing over the deck, pounding so hard that water likely forced its way into the ship. Ice formed quickly, adding dangerous weight to her superstructure. The men below deck heard the thunder of waves striking the hull again and again, like the blows of some relentless hammer. Every strike threatened seams, rivets, and welds. Above, the wind howled through the rigging, screaming like 1,000 voices. Despite everything, McSorley remained calm on the radio. His decades of experience allowed him to speak with the measured tone of someone who had seen countless storms and lived to tell of them. But even he admitted to the Anderson's captain that this was one of the worst seas I've ever been in. For McSorley, who had sailed the lakes for over 40 years, that statement was extraordinary. If he was worried, his men must have been terrified. Through the evening hours, the two ships pressed on, battered but still afloat. The Anderson relayed weather updates, and the Fitzgerald responded when she could. At times, the radio crackled with static, the storm's fury overwhelming the signals. At other times, brief messages cut through, reminders that both ships were still fighting, still alive. To the men aboard, those transmissions were lifelines. The knowledge that someone else was out there, enduring the same chaos, gave them courage. Yet as night fell, the storm reached its full power. Darkness on Lake Superior is complete, especially during a storm. The horizon disappears. The sky and water merge into one black expanse, and even the largest ship feels like a toy tossed by unseen hands. Waves rose taller than houses, slamming the Fitzgerald again and again. The Anderson, still trailing, often lost sight of her companion. At times, the Fitzgerald vanished from radar completely, only to reappear moments later, as if teasing the men who watched from afar. Each time she disappeared, hearts stopped. Each time she reappeared, a collective breath was released, but this could not last forever. Every sailor knew it. Storms like this did not simply pass without consequence. Something had to give. Whether it was the weather itself breaking apart or the ships that struggled to survive it. And as the minutes ticked past, it became increasingly clear that the Fitzgerald was in a battle she could not win. By 7 p.m., with the wind still screaming and the waves still towering, the Anderson's crew kept a close watch on their radar screen. The Fitzgerald was still there, still pushing forward, still defying the storm. At 7:10, the Anderson's radio operator asked the question that weighed on everyone's mind. "How are you making out?" McSorley's reply came quickly, his voice steady, his words deceptively simple. "We're holding our own." It was the last time anyone would hear from him, or from the Fitzgerald. Minutes later, the radar screen flickered and the unthinkable happened. The Edmund Fitzgerald, the largest, strongest, most admired freighter on the Great Lakes, vanished. No distress call, no mayday, no desperate last words. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. In that instant, 29 men were lost, swallowed by the dark waters of Superior. For the Anderson, the realization was chilling. They scanned the horizon. They looked for flares, for wreckage, for any sign of the ship they had been in contact with only moments before. But the storm gave nothing back. The Fitzgerald had disappeared as though she had never existed. The storm continued to build in intensity as darkness fell on Lake Superior. The wind howled across the steel decks of the Fitzgerald, rattling loose hatches and screaming through every crevice like an invisible predator circling its prey. The ship, normally a confident giant, now groaned under the weight of the storm. Every wave that slammed against the hull reverberated through the steel, a low rumble that echoed in the bones of the crew. Captain Ernest McSorley, a seasoned mariner nearing the end of his career, stood in the wheelhouse, watching the chaos unfold on radar and through the storm-darkened windows. He had been through storms before, but this one was different. The ferocity, the relentlessness, the sheer size of the waves, it was as if the lake itself wanted to claim the ship. By now, visibility had shrunk to almost nothing, and the Fitzgerald was navigating by instruments alone. Somewhere in the distance, the freighter Arthur M. Anderson was still maintaining visual and radio contact, serving as the Fitzgerald's shadow through the storm. Yet despite their proximity, the Fitzgerald was already beginning to sound different, strained, tired, and in trouble. As the hours passed, the Fitzgerald began to sustain damage. Waves towering higher than 3-story buildings crashed over the bow, sweeping icy water across the deck. Crewmen reported that 2 vent covers had been lost and a fence rail was bent down, leaving parts of the ship exposed to the storm's fury. Even worse, one of the Fitzgerald's massive radar units failed entirely, leaving the vessel half blind. For a ship of its size, radar was not a luxury, it was survival. Without it, Captain McSorley had to rely on the Anderson's updates to guide his path through the chaos. At 3:30 p.m., McSorley radioed the Anderson. "I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm taking some heavy seas over the deck as well. One of my radars is gone. I'm assisting my crew in securing everything as best we can." His voice, though steady, carried an edge of fatigue that seasoned sailors rarely let slip. These words painted a picture of a proud ship already wounded, her crew fighting against both the storm and time itself. By early evening, the situation worsened. The Fitzgerald began to list, meaning it was leaning to one side, an ominous sign of water entering the ship. With the vents damaged, there was a strong chance water was flooding into her cargo holds. On a calm day, the Fitzgerald was an indomitable fortress of steel. On this night, in the grip of Lake Superior, she was becoming vulnerable, her strength eroded wave by wave. Radio communication between the two ships grew more frequent. McSorley, once confident, now sounded measured, cautious, even strained. He spoke of the storm's violence with blunt honesty, describing it as one of the worst he had ever seen. In a chilling admission, he radioed at 7:10 p.m. "We are holding our own." Those words, while seemingly steady, revealed the harsh truth. This ship was no longer sailing with ease, but clinging desperately to survival. The Anderson's crew, fighting their own battle against the storm, tried to keep in touch with the Fitzgerald, serving as its lifeline of information. At around 7:15 p.m., Captain Jesse Cooper of the Anderson warned of a developing line of heavy waves and squalls ahead, something that could deliver a deadly blow if it struck at the wrong moment. McSorley acknowledged the warning, his voice calm but heavy, as if carrying the weight of an entire crew's fate. That was the last message anyone would ever hear from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Those final words, "We are holding our own," were both haunting and heroic, a last stand against the merciless power of nature. Moments later, the Fitzgerald vanished from radar. There was no mayday, no distress call, no desperate plea for help. One moment the ship was there, locked in a desperate struggle with the storm, and the next she was gone, swallowed whole by Lake Superior. The crew of the Anderson immediately knew something was wrong. For a ship as large as the Fitzgerald, to vanish without a word was unthinkable. Radar operators scanned their screens repeatedly, certain it had to be an error. They called out over the radio, their voices cutting through the static, desperate for any reply. The silence was deafening. The Anderson pressed forward, braving the storm in hopes of finding debris, a lifeboat, or anything that might signal survivors. But Lake Superior revealed nothing. The surface was barren, a churning expanse of black water and white spray, as if the ship had never existed. It was one of the most chilling disappearances in maritime history. In less than a minute, 29 men, along with one of the most powerful freighters ever built, had slipped beneath the waves without a trace. For hours afterward, the Anderson and other nearby ships continued to search, straining their eyes through the storm. They expected at least to see wreckage, cargo, lifeboats, or bodies, but the lake gave them nothing. It was as though the Fitzgerald had been swallowed whole, dragged to the bottom in an instant. This is what made the tragedy so haunting. The silence, the suddenness, the lack of any distress call. Even in the most desperate moments, ships almost always send out some warning. The Fitzgerald did not. Its final words carried a strange calm and then nothing. For many, it suggested that whatever happened to the ship was catastrophic and instantaneous, leaving the crew no time to act. This mystery, this vanishing without a cry for help, is what has kept the legend of the Edmund Fitzgerald alive for decades. It wasn't just a sinking. It was an event that defied logic, a puzzle written in steel and storm. When the storm finally began to weaken in the early hours of November 11th, the search intensified. Coast Guard cutters, aircraft, and merchant vessels all converged on the last known position of the Fitzgerald. They scoured the waters, searching for anything that might provide an answer. Eventually, lifeboats and bits of wreckage were found, battered and torn apart by the waves, but they offered no clues. The lifeboats in particular appeared damaged, suggesting they had been ripped away by force rather than launched by the crew. This discovery deepened the mystery. Had the crew attempted to abandon ship? Or had the Fitzgerald gone down so fast they never had the chance? Questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. The sudden disappearance of the Edmund Fitzgerald turned what might have been another tragic but explainable storm, sinking into something far more unsettling. With no distress call, no witnesses, and no survivors, the loss of the Fitzgerald became a story of whispers, theories, and shadows. It was as though Lake Superior had decided to keep her secrets buried beneath its icy depths. And for the families of the 29 men, the uncertainty made their grief even heavier. They were left with no closure, only haunting last words, an empty horizon, and a legend that was only just beginning to take shape.